Treble River by Betsy Byers, Chapter 4, On the Unknown. For the second time that evening, Dewey raised his oar. He steadied himself and then turned slowly and looked back at the cabin. He heard Brownie mooing at the pasture gate, and he could see the chimney against the starlit sky. Turning quickly, he straightened the oar. The sense of being pursued was strong, and he wanted to send the raft flying over the water. It was this eagerness that made him stretch forward too far with the oar. Here we go! He lost his balance for a moment. The oar slipped from his hand and fell with a splash into the water. Quickly, he went down on his knees and grabbed for the oar, just as it floated out of reach. Wait a minute, his grandma said in a hushed voice. Don't start rowing yet. I won't. On his stomach, he reached out his arms and sighed with relief as his fingers closed around the oar. I think I just heard something, she whispered. It was just me. The oar slipped out of my hands. No, back there. She turned in her chair, and at once he straightened and looked over his shoulder. What was it? Shh. They waited. Slowly the raft drifted down the river. The wind had stopped, and there was not even the sound of the rippling water to break the stillness. The sound came again, a trembling call, and then a whistle that ran down the scale. There, she whispered. Did you hear that? That was a screech owl, Grandma. Not like any screech owl I ever heard. Indian, maybe. No, an owl, he insisted. Surely the Indian could not have returned so swiftly, he thought. Suddenly he was cold with sweat. He and his grandma listened without speaking. They drifted past a dark clump of cottonwoods and into an unsheltered stretch of water that made Dewey crouch lower on the raft. His grandma, in her white bonnet, seemed to tower above him. Get down, Grandma. She leaned forward in her chair. The sound came again, and they listened until the whistle faded. Sounds like an Indian, his grandma whispered. An owl. Well, if it was an owl, she said testily, then it means somebody's going to die. That's just an old saying. Old saying, huh? She said, still whispering. I heard a screech owl the night Aunt Minnie died, and I heard a screech owl the night Pearl Manning died, and my mother heard a screech owl the night the earthquake shook the chimney off our house. She counted the incidents off on her fingers. Well, we're not going to die. He straightened enough to dig his oar into the river. It wavered as he pulled it through the water. Instead of the powerful surge forward he had anticipated, the raft turned slowly sideways so that his grandma was facing the bank. What did you do that for? She whispered irritably. He was as startled as she. I'll straighten it. Still, in an awkward crouch, he stepped around her chair, paddled in the opposite direction, and watched as the raft straightened. His grandma was regarding him sharply with her small blackbird eyes. We ain't got time to be spinning around like a top. Them Indians is liable to be on us any minute, I know. Well, let's get going. He dipped the oar into the water in short, shallow strokes. For a moment the raft seemed caught in the water. He paddled deeply, and the oar touched the muddy bottom of the river. He pushed, and the raft moved sluggishly forward. This thing don't seem to want to go, Grandma said. Dewey paddled earnestly at the back of the raft. Even the gentlest of strokes seemed to make a splashing noise that caused him to cringe. Oh, it'll go, he said, once I get a chance to do some paddling. If you get to do some paddling, she said darkly. She looked back as if expecting to see the Indians at any moment. Once we get around the bends up there, it'll be all right. Probably. Huh? Anyway, that must have been a screech owl we heard back there. If it wasn't, by now we'd be... He broke off quickly and began paddling harder. Be what? She snapped. Scalped? Something like that, he muttered. If you ask me, there ain't no something like getting scalped, except getting scalped. She straightened her chair and settled her bonnet back more firmly on her head. The raft moved slowly along the river. Now the water was shallow enough that he could use the oars and a pole, and push them along. Grandma was silent for a while, and then she said, I hope, boy, that we ain't getting away from the Indians only to get ourselves into worse trouble. There's no worse trouble than Indians, he said. I mean, I hope we ain't setting out on this unknown. I hope you know how far it is we gotta go, and how deep this here water is, where the quicksand is at. You done a little investigating of this river, ain't you? A little. We ain't just setting out on the unknown, then. Not exactly. He thought, though, as he handled the heavy oar, that was exactly what they were doing, setting out on the unknown. He didn't know the river. He didn't know the raft. He wished that he had had time to experiment with both. He could do anything if only he had time to practice by himself. That was the way he learned how to shoot, and there was a pleasure and learning with no one watching. But now, with Grandma there, with her sharp eyes to notice every fault, every slip, he continued to dip the oar into the water. As they rounded the sharp bends in the river, the raft headed steadily toward the opposite bank, and Dewey began paddling quickly. While he paddled, drenching himself with the water, he heard his grandma say, "You better steer away from that bank yonder, boy." "I am," he said through tight lips. But his long, deep strokes seemed to draw them even more directly toward the bank he was trying to avoid. "You better get to it, boy. You can't just wait till the last minute before you start turning it." "Yes'm. The boat ain't nothing to fiddle with." "I'm not fiddling around." Despite all his efforts, the raft continued to head for the bank. He moved around his grandma and jabbed the oar into the water, hoping to strike bottom as he had done before. But the water was deep here, and as he waited, oar outthrust until he could put it against the bank, then he pushed them back into the river's current. "That's better," his grandma said without looking around. "Now keep it out there where it belongs. Don't fiddle around. There's currents in this river. I can feel them pulling us." "Yes'm. And I see we ain't getting very far very fast. Yonder's where we come to get the berries." With her cane she pointed to the bank, and Dewey looked up. It was true. They had made little progress for all his efforts. "We don't go no faster than this. Them Indians will find us come daylight. They don't call it Trouble River for nothing." Quickly he began to dip his oar into the water, first on one side, then on the other. The raft rocked gently with his movement, riding easily in the water now. Dewey wondered suddenly if the Indian had already returned to the cabin, or even if the Indian was going to return. Perhaps he had been frightened and he would never come back. Then this trip down the river was for nothing. But Dewey knew the Indian would return. As silent as a shadow, he would return with his brothers. They would move close around the cabin, unseen, unheard, till they circled it. Then they would fall upon it in a frenzied whoops, invade it, burn it. This was the way it happened. Dewey had heard his parents speak of it at night when they thought he was asleep. He glanced over his shoulder, then at his grandma, who now sat as straight and proper in her chair as if she were in her own parlor awaiting a caller. Charlie lay at her feet with his head propped on the log at the front of the raft. Dewey could smell the pungent odor of the water as he moved the oar from side to side. His brows were drawn together. There was something uncertain about the river that worried him. At times there was a smoothness, a gentleness to the current, and then, around the bend, the river would become strong enough to defy all his efforts with the oar. An hour passed. Dewey shook his arms to ease the tension between his shoulders, and then abruptly he straightened. He looked to the left, and in the moonlight he saw the creek that emptied into the river. His hands tightened on the oar, for he knew this was Dead Man's Creek. Jimmy Sayers had brought Dewey here one afternoon and told him about it. In this creek, 7 years before, the body of a man had been found leaning against the bank as if he were asleep. The man, Jimmy Sayers said, had lost his wagon 40 miles back on the trail when the axle broke. He had also lost his horse at the creek. No one knew how that had happened. And then the man just sat down, leaned back against the bank, and died. There was no reason for it, for he hadn't starved, he hadn't fallen, and he hadn't been shot. He had just given up and died. And Jimmy said, too, that at night, when the moon was bright, the ghost of the man hung around like a white mist over the creek. Scarcely barely daring to breathe, Dewey stretched tall and thought he saw up the creek a way, hanging between the scrub trees like a hammock, the white mist. "Yonder's Dead Man's Creek, Grandma," he said quickly, wanting to know if she saw it too. She glanced to the left. "I'm glad to see you know the river, boy." "Well, I don't know everything about it," he said. "Jimmy and I just rode Buck down here one day." He rested the oar on his raft and leaned against it. His body was wet with sweat, and he felt cold and tired. The oar was heavy, and his shoulders ached from the strain of holding it. Gaining a little speed, the raft continued down the river evenly, and after a moment Dewey sank to his knees and then sat on the back of the raft. He was so tired he could no longer stand. "What are you doing back there? Ain't you going to steer no more?" Grandma asked, turning in her chair to look at him. "I'll steer from down here," he said. "I didn't know you could do it sitting down." "Yes'm, it's just as easy sitting down as if it was standing up." "All right, you keep at it, you hear me? You can't let up for a minute on a river like this one." "Yes'm." He rested his head on his knees. For a moment he watched the dark banks, the low masses of trees. He closed his eyes. "Keep it good and steady," his grandma cautioned. She settled her satchel more firmly in her lap. "Yes'm, I'll keep her good and steady." No sooner were the words out of his mouth than he was asleep. It was a sleep so deep that he might have been in his own bed in the cabin, secure with his parents. His grandma, unaware the raft was at the mercy of the river, continued to give her instructions in a clear voice. Good and steady, and mind them currents, hear me? And with her cane she emphasized her instructions, pointing the way tirelessly. The hollow whistle of the screech owl sounded again, but Dewey did not hear it, nor did he hear the words his grandma spoke over her shoulder. Screech owl, somebody's gonna die.